Assalamu alaikum, everybody. We'll get started in about 1 or 2 minutes, inshallah. Sayyid Mahdi, assalamu alaikum. It's Zain here. How are you?
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. How are you, brother?
Alhamdulillah. Welcome. We'll get started in about a minute or two, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you.
Kumail, assalamu alaikum. Just wanted to check audio. All good? Kumail, assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Wa alaikum salam. Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Give me 1 second. Okay, let's go and get started. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome. Shahadat tonight of our fourth Imam, Imam Zain al-Abideen alayhi salam, and also the 20th of Shohoda Karbala. So we'll get started with Surah Yasin, inshallah, followed by Marsiya, Majalis, Matam, and then inshallah adjourn with Ziyarat. So Kumail, if you're ready, I have the screen share up. Bismillah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ياسين والقرآن الحكيم إنك لمن المرسلين على صراط مستقيم. تنزيل العزيز الرحيم لتنذر قوما ما أنذر آباؤهم فهم غافلون. لقد حق القول على أكثرهم فهم لا يؤمنون. إنا جعلنا في أعناقهم أغلالا فهي إلى الأذقان فهم مقمحون. وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون. وسواء عليهم أأنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون. إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشي الرحمن بالغيب فبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم. إنا نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين. واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم اثنين فكذبوهما فعززنا بثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون. قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزل الرحمن من شيء إن أنتم إلا تكذبون. قالوا ربنا يعلم إنا إليكم لمرسلون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين. قالوا إنا تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم وليمسنكم منا عذاب أليم. قالوا طائركم معكم أئن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون. وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون. وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون. أأتخذ من دونه آلهة إن يردني الرحمن بضر لا تغني عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون. إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين. إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون. قيل ادخل الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفر لي ربي وجعلني من المكرمين. وما أنزلنا على قومه من بعده من جند من السماء وما كنا منزلين إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم خامدون. يا حسرة على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون. ألم يروا كم أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليهم لا يرجعون. وإن كل لما جميع لدينا محضرون. وآية لهم الأرض الميتة أحييناها وأخرجنا منها حبا فمنه يأكلون. وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون. سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون. وآية لهم الليل نسلخ منه النهار فإذا هم مظلمون. والشمس تجري لمستقر لها ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم. والقمر قدرناه منازل حتى عاد كالعرجون القديم. لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر ولا الليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون. وآية لهم أنا حملنا ذريتهم في الفلك المشحون وخلقنا لهم من مثله ما يركبون. وإن نشأ نغرقهم فلا صريخ لهم ولا هم ينقذون إلا رحمة منا ومتاعا إلى حين. وإذا قيل لهم اتقوا ما بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون. وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين. وإذا قيل لهم أنفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا ونطعم من لو يشاء الله أطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين. ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم وهم يخصمون فلا يستطيعون توصية ولا إلى أهلهم يرجعون. ونفخ في الصور فإذا هم من الأجداث إلى ربهم ينسلون. قالوا يا ويلنا من بعثنا من مرقدنا هذا ما وعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم جميع لدينا محضرون فاليوم لا تظلم نفس شيئا ولا تجزون إلا ما كنتم تعملون إن أصحاب الجنة اليوم في شغل فاكهون هم وأزواجهم في ظلال على الأرائك متكئون لهم فيها فاكهة ولهم ما يدعون سلام قولا من رب رحيم وامتازوا اليوم أيها المجرمون ألم أعهد إليكم يا بني آدم ألا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين وأن اعبدوني هذا صراط مستقيم ولقد أضل منكم جبلا كثيرا أفلم تكونوا تعقلون هذه جهنم التي كنتم توعدون اصلوها اليوم بما كنتم تكفرون اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون ولو نشاء لطمسنا على أعينهم فاستبقوا الصراط فأنى يبصرون ولو نشاء لمسخناهم على مكانتهم فما استطاعوا مضيا ولا يرجعون ومن نعمره ننكسه في الخلق أفلا يعقلون وما علمناه الشعر وما ينبغي له إن هو إلا ذكر وقرآن مبين لينذر من كان حيا ويحق القول على الكافرين أولم يروا أنا خلقنا لهم مما عملت أيدينا أنعاما فهم لها مالكون وذللناها لهم فمنها ركوبهم ومنها يأكلون ولهم فيها منافع ومشارب أفلا يشكرون واتخذوا من دون الله آلهة لعلهم ينصرون لا يستطيعون نصرهم وهم لهم جند محضرون فلا يحزنك قولهم إنا نعلم ما يسرون وما يعلنون أولم ير الإنسان أنا خلقناه من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين وضرب لنا مثلا ونسي خلقه قال من يحيي العظام وهي رميم قل يحييها الذي أنشأها أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم الذي جعل لكم من الشجر الأخضر نارا فإذا أنتم منه توقدون أوليس الذي خلق السماوات والأرض بقادر على أن يخلق مثلهم بلى وهو الخلاق العليم إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون فسبحان الذي بيده ملكوت كل شيء وإليه ترجعون صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوات
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
سورة المباركة الفاتحة.
Ahsant. Thank you, Kumail. Mikhail, if you're out there, Bismillah with Marsha.
محمد وعلى محمد صلوات.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
والا میرا نے ہوگا بہن زینب نہ تم رونا میرا نیگا گلوئے خشک پر میں نے چلے گا خند جب خنجر تو اماں سامنے ہوں گی بغن خیموں کے تم در پر خیموں کے تم در پر نہ کاش میرے کچھ اثر ہوگا یہ بولے سید والا میرا نیزے پہ سر ہوگا سکینہ کے گوہر چینیں گے خون اس کا بہائیں گے لگیں گی آگ دامن میں وہ جب خیمے جلائیں گے خیمے جلائیں گے میری بیٹی سے کہہ دینا کہ سونا خاک پر ہوگا یہ بولے سید والا میرا نیزے پہ سر ہوگا وہ پوچھتے سید سجاد سے بستر بھی کھینچیں گے میرے بیمار بیٹے کو اذیت اس طرح دیں گے اذیت اس طرح دیں گے لوٹیں گی چادریں اور سامنے میرا پہ سر ہوگا یہ بولے سید والا میرا نیزے پہ سر ہوگا سکینہ کے لیے چلنا قیامت سے نہ کم ہوگا گلے بارا بندھیں گے ایک رسی میں ستم ہوگا ایک رسی میں ستم ہوگا کہ لینا سانس بھی مشکل سکینہ کس قدر ہوگا یہ بولے سید والا میرا نیزے پہ سر ہوگا سکینہ کو وہ جب باندھیں گے زینب پشت ناقہ پر بہت روئے وہ جب تم کو निशा रस्सी के दिखला कर रस्सी के दिखला कर तो कहना खत्म अब जल्दी बहुत तेरा सफर होगा ये बोले सैयदे वाला मेरा ने जे पे सर होगा الفاتحة مع
اللهم صل
الصلوات
على محمد وآل محمد. سيد مهدي بسم الله. محمد وآل محمد صلوات. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد، وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المنتجبين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. قال الله في كتابه الحكيم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، قد أفلح المؤمنون الذين هم في صلاتهم خاشعون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. وصلوا على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. The 25th of the month of Muharram marks the commemoration of the martyrdom of the fourth Imam of the school of Ahlul Bayt, Al-Imam Zain Abideen, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh. Al-Imam Zain Abideen, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh, is known for leaving behind a very deep and rich spiritual and devotional tradition. Across the schools of thought in Islam, he is known as one of the spiritual masters. Sufi schools of thought, for instance, follow him as one of the spiritual masters. Even among Sunni Muslims, he is highly regarded for his contributions to Islamic spirituality. He is known for the supplications that he left behind. Perhaps what is most remarkable about the character of this Imam, peace be upon him, alayhi salam, is that he took everything that he saw, everything that he witnessed and experienced firsthand, that tragedy, and he was able to, in return, give a gift back to the world. And that gift was the gift of spirituality and devotion. Meaning, regardless of what he had personally experienced, he decided to give the world back a gift. And just thinking about that from an emotional point of view, a psychological point of view, and obviously the Imams of Ahlul Bayt are above the petty reactions of humanity, of the rest of humanity. So they do not internalize aggression and hurt and oppression the way that the rest of humanity might do so. However, at the same time, they were human beings with emotions. It's spectacular to see someone like that be able to give back a gift to humanity, the gift of devotion, the gift of spirituality. And not only that, to be so immersed and so involved and so present in what he did, that his example serves as an inspiration for millions of people worldwide. In Ramadan, normally it's a habit to recite some of those supplications. One of the most common ones is Dua Abi Hamza al-Thumali. And one of the recurring elements in that dua, in that supplication, and in other supplications, is the element of hope, amal, raja. And we today understand, based off of research and other things, we realize today the power of having hope, the power of having that amal or raja that comes up in the narrations, in the supplications of the Imam alayhi salam. You know, when you study the power of hope or the psychology of hope, there was one study where a number of students, they were asked a theoretical question that if they had to take a test and that test determined a significant part of their grade, and then they realized after taking the test that they failed, what would they do? So they measured the amount of hope, and based off of the hope that they had, what they would do in order to reconcile and to get back on track. And so the students with very low amounts of hope, they didn't do anything. You know, they took that as a final verdict. The ones with medium amounts of hope, they thought of doing something, but they never really executed. But the ones that had high hope, they actually thought of different ways to get back on track, and then they pursued it, even though they had a setback, a significant setback, something that others thought was the final verdict, and there was no way to move forward. And if you think about that, that reminds us a little bit of the parable of life. You know, think about being there on the day of judgment and realizing that a lot of what I did that I was not I didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to, but a lot of what I was doing was undoing the good deeds. And so you find yourself on the day of judgment standing in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, standing in front of that scale and realizing that your bad deeds outweigh your good deeds. Or maybe there's an equal amount of good and bad. And the Quran actually tells us that story in Surah Al-A'raf. Al-A'raf in the Quran refers to the heights. That's the meaning of that term. And the heights are a location, a metaphoric location on the Day of Judgment, where people who have the equal amount of good and bad, they're placed on those heights and they're able to see the people of heaven on one side and the people of hell on one side. And the Quran describes a conversation that takes place between the people of the heights with the people of hell and the people of the heights and people of heaven. And it's because of their position, because of the generosity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that He eventually leads those people to paradise, even though there was an equal amount of good and evil. But that's also directly related to how much hope we have. And Imam Zain al-Abideen alayhi salam, he says that what I hinge myself on is not the good that I've done. It's not what I've put forth, but rather the hope that I have, O Allah, that you are going to overlook some of the evil that I may have intentionally or unintentionally done, and you are generous to me because of that hope, even if I haven't done anything to actually earn your reward, your blessings, your paradise. And doesn't that describe us, humanity, in this day and age? We keep returning to sin, we keep returning to disobedience. But the one thing that we hinge ourselves on is that amal, that raja, that hope. So to be able to give that hope, that gift of hope to humanity, even though you had witnessed the most heinous crimes and atrocities committed in front of you, That's something that's very powerful, very significant. And so tonight I want to talk to you about how the Imam alayhi salam was able to sort of give that gift back, and then also moving further, what was so special about his devotional practices. See, the devotional practices that were taught to us from the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, the way that they spoke to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the way that they engaged with those acts were very, very special. It's not just what is said, if you've noticed it. It's not just what is said, but how it is delivered as well, how it is said. I'll give you an example. On the day of Arafat, which is in the month before the month of the Hajjah, which is immediately before, it immediately precedes the month of Muharram. On the day of Arafat, we recite the dua of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, dua Arafah. It's known as dua Arafah. And that's a very powerful dua. It's a very powerful supplication in terms of conveying that sense of hope and optimism, because what's also related to hope is optimism. And when you have hope and optimism, that's called, the term for that is called self-efficacy. So not only having hope, but also having optimism. But what's so special about that supplication, which I'll share with you, it's not just what is being said, but it's how it's being said. So if you look at that dua, the narration is from two brothers, Bishr wa Bashir ibn Ghalib al-Asadi. They say the following. They say, we were with Imam Hussein in Arafah in the evening. So on the day of Arafah in the evening, His Eminence came out and listened to the description with utmost humility and respect. Not boastful, not, hey everyone, listen to me, I'm about to drop a masterpiece in front of you. You know, whenever you write something, if you've ever written a paper or a poem or something that you've composed that you're very proud of, you know, you carry that pride. Sometimes it's more than just pride and confidence. Sometimes it's hubris, overconfidence. That wasn't the Imam, even though the dua was a masterpiece. They say that he came out with utmost humility and respect, and that he was accompanied with some of the Ahlul Bayt and some of the companions and some of the servants. And he raised up his hands before his face to pray, and like a beggar asking for food, this is the description, like a beggar asking for food, he recited, and then the dua starts. Like a beggar asking for food. If you've ever been to certain countries, and sometimes you'll even see it here in the United States, but if you go to certain third world countries where people are extending their hand for food like a beggar, that's the way that Imam Hussein spoke to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then towards the middle, the dua says the following. Then he began to supplicate. He occupied himself with prayer as tears ran from his blessed eyes. In the middle of the dua, tears begin to run from the blessed eyes of the Imam. Then he said, he continues. So what's he crying from? What does the Imam have to fear? Is there something that he's fearing? And then towards the end, the narration continues, the narrator continues to describe the physical and emotional state of the Imam. Tears were flowing from his blessed eyes as if they were two water containers. Imagine if you've ever poured out a water container. That's how tears were flowing from his blessed eyes. So this entire description, none of this was scripted. This was a result of complete immersion and engagement with the task at hand. So when they prayed, when they supplicated, it was not just a scripted event. Sometimes when we stand to pray in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I'll be the first to admit, I feel like this much of the time, and it's my responsibility to change this. Sometimes you feel like it's a scripted event. It's something that you're just doing repetitively over and over again. versus being fully engaged and immersed in the process. So what does that immersion look like from a practical point of view? I just want to share with you something that I came across recently that had no religious or scientific context, no religious or spiritual context behind it whatsoever. But as I was reading this, I was thinking, this makes sense because it's beginning to explain everything that I've learned about the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, the prophets and the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, being fully immersed and engaged in the activity at hand, whether it was dua, whether it was prayer, whether it was whatever it was, their interaction with people around them, their interaction with their companions and with one another. And so I came across this idea, and maybe some of you have heard of this before, but it's an idea called flow. And they study this with you know, the psychology and of success and emotional intelligence. They call this flow. And what flow refers to is when someone is completely immersed in the task at hand, and it requires their complete emotional engagement with the subject at hand, whatever is happening. So I'll give you a few examples of how researchers describe flow. And then as you hear this, think about what it means to be immersed and emotionally connected, engaged, and involved with your daily rituals. So there's a number of examples for this, for flow. They say flow happens in a number of ways. So basically, when you're in the zone of something, they said that they did research on surgeons who were, for instance, able to successfully remove a tumor, or surgeons who were able to perform an operation with minimal, what do they call it? You know, blood spillage, basically, without damaging anything, without, you know, whatever that's called, you know, medically. And they say that those surgeons are able to achieve that state of flow. And in that moment, they're not thinking about, and I actually spoke to a surgeon recently about this, and they're not thinking in that moment about the external rewards. They're not thinking about how much they're going to get paid based off of this surgery. In fact, sometimes the pay, depending on the situation and everything, the pay is very, very meager. One of the surgeon that I was speaking to, he said, sometimes we get the paycheck for a surgery, and it's, they might as well not pay at all because it's so little. But he says that the intrinsic reward, knowing that I'm doing my best to help this person get rid of this tumor or whatever it is, that requires me to be fully engaged, sometimes even emotionally engaged in what I'm doing. So that's one place where psychologists and researchers detected this thing called flow. Another place is with rock climbers. When a rock climber has to fully engage themselves with the task at hand so that they're able to navigate themselves, safely through this path up this rock. Because if they're not fully engaged, if they're not fully immersed in what they're doing, they'll fall to their death. And then a third is with Melanese sailors. So Melanesia is, there's Micronesia, Polynesia, Melanesia, the islands that are basically northeast of Australia. If you look at a map, those places. And what they found was that those sailors, they were so engaged and they had such a good sense of direction. They were so immersed with the task at hand that even when they were taken hundreds of miles away on a boat from their island, they were able to get back just by looking at the direction of the waves in the water and the intensity of the waves. So they were fully immersed at the task at hand. They were fully engaged with the task at hand. And so what these psychologists say is that state of flow, of immersion happens. One way to achieve that is when you focus on the internal and intrinsic rewards of the task at hand. And look at it from a religious and spiritual point of view. the narration that's attributed to Imam Ali alayhi salam, where he says those that worship for the hope that something is going to come back in return. He says that is the worship of merchants, because when a merchant does business, he's giving something and he wants an ROI. He wants something to come back in return. He says that is the worship of merchants. And the person who worships out of fear of punishment, well, that's the worship of slaves, because a slave does something out of fear that his master is going to punish him. But the one who worships Allah because he believes that Allah is the most worthy of worship, that is the worship of free men, of free women. They're not thinking about reward, they're not thinking about punishment, they're thinking of the external reward that comes from engaging in that ritual and in that act. So, is there a scientific understanding behind this level of concentration and immersion and engagement? Many of you are familiar with the historic narrative that describes how Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam was injured in the Battle of Siffin. He had something like an arrow or a spearhead, something like that, which was lodged in his leg. And it was so painful to remove it under normal circumstances. You know, back then they didn't have what they have in the hospitals today of, you know, in terms of sedating the patient or anesthesia and all of that. You know, they had certain things, but for the most part, surgery was very painful. It was excruciating. So it was so painful to remove it under normal circumstances. The narration says that they asked Al-Imam al-Hasan al-Mujtaba alayhi salam. And he said, if you really want to accomplish the task without any resistance, without any trouble, move it while he's engaged in prayer. Because when Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam is engaged in prayer, he's fully immersed. He's not thinking about anything else that happens on the outside. And that's exactly what they did. So is there an actual study? Is there anything that explains how that phenomena happens from a research and a scientific point of view? I want to share with you something that I came across recently, and it's a 2016 study by Jefferson Health. And they wanted to figure out what is the effects of the Islamic prayer? What does it do? Like, what's going on in the brain when someone is praying and they are in tune with their prayer? They are engaged, they achieve that state of flow, if you will. And it says the following. I'll just share a very, very short synopsis with you. It says, in the first study of its kind, a case series examined the neurophysiological effects of Islamic prayer. And this is what it showed. It showed that the practice, meaning the prayer, decreased blood flow to areas of the brain controlling willful behavior and movement, as well as sense of self. So they had a few participants who were praying. They hooked them up to machines, whatever they did. They mapped out what was going on in the brain, and they found that the areas of the brain that are responsible for willful movement and behavior and a sense of self, there was decreased blood flow to those areas. What does that mean? They say this finding is consistent with Islam's central theme of surrender. When we talk about surrender, Islam, al-Islam huwa taslim, Islam is to surrender. We found that to be actually true from a neurophysiological perspective when people engaged in prayer. And you can look up the study for yourself at Jefferson Health, by Jefferson Health in 2016. So once we engage and we really immerse ourselves in that prayer, we begin to lose that sense of self and that sense of willful behavior. So then the question becomes, how do we take this into our consciousness? So how do we engage? How do we immerse? How do we make the most out of our daily work and our rituals? Number one is reframing how we think of interest. sometimes I get this sometimes where people, come up to me and they say, look, I'll admit I haven't been praying. Maybe it's been a few months, a few weeks, a few years, whatever. And I want to get back into the groove. I want to get back into the flow of things. But I can't engage. I'm not really that interested. And I think especially if I can speak on behalf of at least my generation, and maybe the generation after or before, but at least for my generation, is that sometimes there's this tendency to believe that you have to fall in love with something as soon as you engage with it, right? You hear young people saying, I have to love what I do when they describe their careers, for instance. I have to love what I do. And I agree with that in the sense that you don't want to do something if you're hating it. But the challenge is that love, that fulfillment, sometimes we can expect that to happen with minimal engagements rather than maximum engagement and immersion and flow. To be interested in prayer, you actually have to pray consistently. You can't do it once a week or once a month and think, I'm gonna fall in love with my prayer. To love the act of dua and supplication, it's not something that you can do once every 6 months or once every 3 years. You have to really be consistent with what you're doing. And so reframing how we think about interest, right? So this is one way. Number two is research also shows that people have optimal experience when they engage with something that is engaging enough to where it's not boring, but it's just engaging enough to where it's also not overwhelming. Sometimes we engage with something and because it doesn't happen frequently, it kind of becomes boring. So it's not challenging enough. And then sometimes we try to commit to something that is so challenging that we know we're going to fail. Such as when people set these expectations for themselves when it comes to, saving money, finances, business, health, eating habits, changing your eating habits, going to the gym. They set these goals which are so engaging, requires such an immense level of engagement that it becomes unattainable, that you're going to fail. And that's why there's a principle in Islamic jurisprudence that says that the religion is not meant to impose unbearable hardships. And the Quran speaks to that effect. لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها. That God does not impose anything upon anyone beyond what they can bear, beyond what they're expected to bear. So finding something which is engaging enough, and that's why if you look at the Islamic prayer, it's just enough. If you look at the wajibat, the obligations, it's just enough to where it's not boring, it's challenging, it does challenge you, but it's not overbearing. It's not fasting the entire year. It's fasting 1 month out of the year. It's not praying every second of every day. It's that 5 times a day or the 3 times spent. So this is the second. And number 3 is we need to also change the meaning of what we do. If you want to become interested in something, and if you really want to engage in something, you have to just change the meaning of that thing. What does that mean? I'll give you a story. Some of you maybe have heard this story. It says that one day a man walked by 3 men who were laying bricks. And he asked the first one, he said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm laying bricks." He asked the second one, he said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm building a wall." He asked the third one, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm building the house of God." All 3 of them were engaging with the same action, but each one had a different purpose and a different meaning behind what they were doing. And that's why you'll find that some people, you'll find 2 people that both pray the 5 daily prayers. They both engage in the same, maybe in the same level of supplication, the same amount quantity-wise, but one is of a higher quality because that act for that person has more of a profound meaning and purpose behind it. You know, all of us are searching for meaning and purpose behind our lives. And so we need to search for meaning and purpose behind the actions that we put forth. What's the meaning behind this? This thing that I'm repeating over and over again. So once we start to engage, once we start to immerse ourselves, once we start to enter into that state of flow, magical things begin to happen. You know, there's one narration that describes exactly what happens when we engage. It's a hadith Qudsi, which is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it says that my servants, us, the ibad, the servants, my servant shall continue as long as he engages with not just the bare bones minimum, which is the 5 daily prayers, but the nawafil, right? The extra prayers, such as Salat al-Ghufayla, Salat al-Layl, for instance, right? Nafilat al-Subuh. That he continues to engage. And as he continues to engage, Allah is saying, I increase in my love for him. And as I increase in my love for him, he says, I become the eyes by which he sees, and the ears by which he hears, and the hands by which he does, by which he executes. So once we start to engage fully, it's not that, you know, we have the same sight of God or the same sense of hearing as God, وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ, because لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. There's nothing that is similar to God. God is unique in that regard. But one other narration describes and gives a little bit of meaning and context to this idea. It says, Abdi ata'ni takun mathali. My servant, my slave, you, human being, obey me, not just obey, but, you know, intentional obedience. You shall be similar to me, takun mathali. In the same way that I say kun fayakun, I say be and it becomes, you say be and things will become. Meaning that you will begin to manifest the things that you are after in your life. Very powerful concept. Here's the catch though. How many of us, including myself, I ask this question all the time, how many of us actually reach that stage, that level of dedication, of purposeful commitment, of full engagement with what we do, to where we reach those sublime stages? When you look at the example of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, Imam Zain Abideen alayhi salam, and how they engaged in their prayers, in their rituals, they were in a complete state of immersion, khushu'. And that's why it became something that was not scripted. It didn't need to be scripted because it came directly from the well of the heart, from the abyss, the internal abyss. And Imam Zain al-Abideen alayhi salam, for those roughly 35 years that he lived after the day of Ashura, continued to preach the spiritual and devotional tradition that he was meant to. He found that the ummah, their hearts and their minds and their souls and the spirit of the ummah was dead. And that's why what happened. It's because people were dead. Imam Ali alayhi salam, he says, "An-nasu niyam, idha matu intabahu." People are asleep. When they die, they shall wake up. Death becomes that great awakening. And so the death, the murder, the martyrdom of Imam Hussein alayhi salam became not just an individual awakening, it became a collective awakening for the ummah. And Imam Zain al-Abideen sought to keep that life continuous through his spiritual tradition. And part of the spiritual tradition, by the way, was reminding people of the tragedy that happened on the day of Ashura. For many, many years, Imam Zain al-Abideen would weep immensely. One time, Abu Hamza al-Thumali, Thabit ibn Dinar, that righteous companion, he asks him, he says, Yabna Rasulullah, he says, Al-qatlu lakum aada wa karamatukum min Allah al-shahada. Why is it that you have spent these so many years weeping? Isn't death, murder, assassination, isn't that something that is commonplace in your family, something that you're used to, something that you expect? The Imam replies to him, he says, Bala, yes, Abu Hamza, spot on, correct. He says, the reason I weep is every time I look at the women folk in my family. Imam Zain al-Abideen became the steward of the women after Ashura. Even though he was so weak physically, he began to slowly regain his strength. And so he became the steward of that family. While Zainab alayhi salam, she took that very noble stance and she made sure everyone was doing well. He also, when he was able to, he would speak up. He says, every time I see those women, all I can remember is them running from one tent to another tent on that night after my father was killed. They set fire to the tents. They said, "Ahriqu buyut al-zalimin," burn down the homes of the oppressors. Imagine, the Ahlul Bayt in those moments were being called oppressors, rebels, insurgents. أحرقوا بيوت الظالمين. So he says, every time I look at these women, I remember them running from one tent to another. The tents are on fire, their clothes are on fire. Hamid ibn Muslim, who was a reporter from Kufa that was present on the day of Ashura, he narrates, he says that I saw a little girl running from one tent to another. All of a sudden she saw me and she kind of took a step back and she said to me, she said, "Oh Sheikh, are you with us or are you against us?" She had to know if she can trust him. She said, "Are you with us or are you against us?" He said, I'm not with you, nor am I against you. I'm just here as an observer. He says, "What are you doing? Why are you running from one tent to another?" She said, he asked her to identify herself. She says, "Oh Sheikh, do you know who I am?" She says, "Have you read the Quran?" He said, "Yes, I've read the Quran." She says, "Have you read the verse, فَأَمَّا الْيَتِيمَ فَلَا تَقْهَرْ?" The verse that commands us to do good and to be kind to the orphans? He says, "Yes, I'm familiar with that verse." She says, "I am the orphan of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein. I am the daughter of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein." She says to him, "I have one request from you. Can you take me towards Al-Ghari?" Al-Ghari was the old name for the city that we now call Najaf, where Amir al-Mu'mineen is buried. He said, "Why?" He said, "That's such a far distance. Why would you want to go there now in the middle of the night?" She said, "Because I have a grandfather there that's buried. And I'm told that anyone who goes to him with anything in their heart shall be granted their wish." He said, "It's way too far of a distance. I can't take you there." She said, "Then I want you to take me to the Euphrates River." He said, "Why? What's there?" She said, "I have my uncle Al-Abbas there. He's the second best person that you can take me to. Take me to my uncle Al-Abbas, the man who refused to get up, the man who refused to be carried back to the tent of Hussein." She said, "Now that we have water, I want to take back water for him, since he was the one that vowed to bring us back water, but he was not able to. Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un." And Imam Zain al-Abideen had to witness all of this happening in front of him. On that day, one of the most tragic experiences of the Imam is that he had to he had to go out and bury the bodies of the Ahlul Bayt and the Shohada after they were beheaded, after they were trampled under the horses, after the army had threatened to punish the local population, that if they tried to touch these bodies and bury them, they would be punished. They wanted these bodies to lay under the sun for 3 days. Imam Zain al-Abideen, finally, when people come out and they defy those orders, the Imam goes out and he wants to bury the body of his father. How do you identify the body of Hussein? When it does not have a head, when the clothes were stripped off, when the armor was stripped off, when the ring was stripped off. The only thing that lay on the body of Imam Hussein was a piece of cloth, a piece of torn cloth that he had intentionally put on his body before he went out into the battlefield for the final time. He had intentionally requested that a cloth of low value be put on his body so that when they began to steal from his body, that nobody would want this piece of cloth. How do you identify the body of a man that has no head, that has been injured from top to bottom, that is bloodied, that has been trampled under the hooves of the horses? What is left for you to identify? He finally identified the body of Hussein alayhi salam. Narrations say that as he would pick up one part of the body, another part would fall off. Imagine this. This was the body of Hussein alayhi salam. This was the neck and chest that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam himself would kiss and embrace and say, Husaynun minni wa ana min Husayn. Hussein is from me and I am from Hussein. Ahabba Allah man ahabba Husayna. So Imam Zain al-Abideen did the best that he could. He ordered a cloth to be brought, and they picked up the body parts of Imam Hussein and placed it in that cloth and lowered it into the grave. Many months later, when Imam Zain al-Abideen returned to Medina, one day he saw a man slaughtering some cattle. But before he would slaughter it, he would give it water. And he turned to him, he says, Ya Hada, he says, is this a practice that you have? That you give the animal water before you slaughter it? He says, of course we would. This is our regular protocol. This is what we normally do. He says, then why is it that the grandson of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was slaughtered from the neck while he was thirsty? Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. That was the tragedy that he lived and that he taught and propagated for the rest of his life. وَسَيَعْلَمُ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا أَيَّ مُنْقَلَبٍ يَنْقَلِبُونَ وَالْعَاقِبَةُ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. Brothers and sisters, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept our a'mal during these nights, the nights of Muharram and soon Safar as well. Even though we are not able to congregate in person in large gatherings, it has been a blessing that we've been able to make many Husayniyas out of our homes, that we are able to bring the majalis and the barakah of the majalis into our homes. We ask Allah to continue to enlighten our homes with the barakah of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept the a'mal of all of you, of all of our community members. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bring relief to all of those worldwide who are in need of relief. And let us remember the people in this majlis, whom this majlis is for, the marhumin. We send our condolences to the dear Dewji family on the passing, the commemoration of the anniversary of the passing away of Al-Hajj Abdul Razak Dewji, the father of our dear brother Hajj Khalil Dewji. So to the entire Dewji family, we send our condolences to all of their marhumin and to all of the rest of the marhumin that are mentioned in this program. Let us, for their soul, let us recite a Fatiha ma'a salat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Maliki yawm ad-Din. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين.
اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. Ahsan. Thank you, Sayyid Mahdi.
Ya Hussein, 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 Ya Hussein. چادر سر پہ نہیں ساتے علمدار نہیں، چادر سر پہ نہیں ساتے علمدار نہیں، چادر سر پہ نہیں ساتے علمدار نہیں، دیش بیگانہ یہاں کوئی مددگار نہیں، دیش بیگانہ یہاں کوئی مددگار نہیں، چادر سر پہ نہیں ساتے علمدار نہیں، ہے شامیو شرم کرو دور ہاتھوں پیدا کرو، شامیو شرم کرو دور ہاتھوں پیدا کرو، زارا ثانی ہے کبھی آئیے بازار نہیں، زارا ثانی ہے کبھی آئیے بازار نہیں، چادر سر پہ نہیں ساتے علمدار نہیں، چادر سر پہ نہیں ساتے علمدار نہیں، ہو شمر ظلم نہ کر روکے تو فضا نے کہا، اے شمر ظلم نہ کر روکے تو فضا نے کہا، تازیانے کے قبل عابد بیمار نہیں، تازیانے کے قبل عابد بیمار نہیں، چادر سر پہ نہیں ساتے علمدار نہیں، چادر سر پہ نہیں ساتے علمدار نہیں، او اے مسلمانو ہمیں چند ردائے دے دو، اے مسلمانو ہمیں چند ردائے دے دو، مانگتا ہے کہ سوا کچھ بھی یہ بیمار نہیں، مانگتا ہے کہ سوا کچھ بھی یہ بیمار نہیں، چادر سر پہ نہیں ساتے علمدار نہیں، چادر سر پہ نہیں ساتے علمدار نہیں، ہے دیش بیگانہ یہاں کوئی مددگار نہیں، دیش بیگانہ یہاں کوئی مددگار نہیں، چادر سر پہ نہیں ساتے علمدار نہیں، چادر سر پہ نہیں ساتے علمدار نہیں، یا حسین یا حسین یا اور محمد وآل محمد صلوات.
اللهم صل على Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Ahsant. Thank you, Jawad Bhai. Surah Mubarak al-Fatiha. Just a couple of quick announcements, inshallah. So Surah Yasin was recited for the Isal Sawab of Marhum Haj Abdul Razak Dewji, Marhuma Khairun Asar, Marhuma Zubayda Dewji, and all the marhumeens of the Dewji, Asr, Karmali, and Dharamsi families. So let's recite Surah Al-Mubarak Al-Fatiha for their departed souls and also for all the marhumeens in our families, inshallah. Also, let's recite 5 times Amma Yujibu for those people that are sick in our families and those around the world. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Amma yujibul mustarra iza da'ahu wa yakshifu su. 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 Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Just a couple of quick upcoming program announcements. Inshallah, our next program will be on September 24th, where we will be commemorating the Shahadat of Imam Hassan alayhi salam. And then inshallah, on October 1st, we will be commemorating the wafat of Bibi Sakina alayhi salam and the 30th of Shohoda Karbala. Following that, then we will lead into Ashra Zainabiyya, inshallah. With that, we will conclude with the ziyarat. So Summer and Faiz, if you're ready.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum ya Aba Abdullah. Assalamu alaikum ya Amna Rasulullah. Assalamu alaikum ya Amna Amir al-Mu'mineen wa Amna Sayyid al-Wasiyin. Assalamu alaikum ya Amna Fatima Zahra. Sayyidati Nisa al-Alamin. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu alaikum ya Sahib al-Zaman. Assalamu alaikum ya Khalifat al-Rahman. Assalamu alaikum ya Sharik al-Quran. Assalamu alaikum ya Maulana Sahib al-Asr wal-Zaman. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Allahumma kulli waliyika wa jadid al-Hassan salawatuka alayhi wa ala bai fi hasi sa'a wa fi kulli sa'a waliyan wa hafiza wa qaidan wa nasira wa ta'lilan wa aina hatta taskinahu warzakatu wa matahu fiha tawilan rahmatika ya arhamar rahimin.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Great job. Thank you. Ahsant. With that, that concludes our program for tonight. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.